The morning started like any other for Captain Roberts, an experienced pilot with over 15,000 flight hours under his belt. The weather forecast showed clear skies with minimal turbulence, and Flight 2311 was scheduled for an on-time departure. Passengers boarded the Airbus A320 with the usual mix of excitement and routine, unaware that they were about to become part of aviation history. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 36,000 feet over the mountains, there was absolutely no indication of the mechanical nightmare that was about to unfold. Just 45 minutes into the flight, a deafening bang rocked the aircraft, followed immediately by violent shaking that could be felt throughout the cabin. The first engine had catastrophically failed, sending fragments of metal tearing through critical systems. In the cockpit, warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel as Captain Roberts and his co-pilot worked through their emergency procedures. What they didn't know yet was that their situation was about to become far worse than a standard single-engine failure, something that pilots train for regularly and can typically manage without incident. Only 28 seconds after the first failure, the unthinkable happened. The second engine sputtered and went silent. The aircraft was now essentially a giant glider, with no power, rapidly losing altitude over some of the most challenging terrain on the continent. The sudden silence in the cockpit was deafening. At this point, statistics and flight history weren't on their side. Dual-engine failures at cruising altitude are exceedingly rare, and the survival rate historically had been almost non-existent. Most aviation experts would have given the flight little chance of making it to any airport. What happened next defied all expectations and wrote a new chapter in aviation history. Instead of panicking, Captain Roberts recalled a similar incident he'd studied years earlier, involving a flight over the Atlantic. "We've got approximately 15 minutes of controlled descent," he told his co-pilot with remarkable composure. "Let's identify all possible landing sites within our glide range." Using the aircraft's forward momentum and carefully calculated descent angles, they began an emergency procedure that would require perfect execution with zero margin for error. The next few minutes would determine whether 183 souls would live or perish in what was quickly becoming one of the most challenging emergency landings ever attempted. Time was the enemy as the massive aircraft descended at over 1,000 feet per minute with no power to stop its inevitable date with the ground. Captain Roberts had just 90 seconds to make decisions that would determine the fate of everyone on board. The nearest major airport was 70 miles away, far beyond their glide range. 3 smaller airfields appeared as possibilities on our navigation systems, but each presented significant challenges. One was partially fogged in, another had a runway that might be too short, and the third would require flying over a populated area with an aircraft they couldn't guarantee they could fully control. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed the extraordinary decision-making process that followed. Rather than immediately committing to any of the obvious choices, Captain Roberts rapidly assessed alternative possibilities while delegating specific tasks to his co-pilot. "Check for highways, fields, anything flat within 30 miles, he instructed, while simultaneously calculating their best glide speed. This approach, expanding options rather than narrowing them prematurely, would later be taught in flight schools worldwide as the Roberts Protocol. It exemplifies how expert decision-makers avoid the tunnel vision that often accompanies high-stress situations. While passengers were being prepared for an emergency landing by the cabin crew, Captain Roberts made what experts later called the most crucial decision of the entire incident. Instead of attempting to reach any of the charted airfields, he identified a dry riverbed that offered both length and relative flatness. This choice required threading the aircraft between 2 hills and executing a difficult turning maneuver with precise timing. What made this decision truly remarkable was that it contradicted conventional wisdom about always prioritizing established runways. Later analysis showed that had he attempted to reach any of the airports, the aircraft would have fallen short by several miles. The decision made, Captain Roberts now faced the challenge of communicating with air traffic control while managing their rapidly diminishing altitude. "We need immediate clearance of all airspace within 30 miles of our position," he radioed. We are attempting an off-airport landing at the following coordinates. The controller's voice betrayed his shock. In 20 years on the job, he'd never handled a dual-engine failure at altitude. Yet the calm professionalism in the pilot's voice gave him confidence to immediately clear all traffic and coordinate emergency responses. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued its silent descent. Now, just 8 minutes from touching down on a surface never designed for a 150,000-pound aircraft. With both engines dead silent, the cockpit was eerily quiet except for the rush of wind outside the fuselage. Captain Roberts had to completely recalibrate his approach technique. Everything he'd trained for assumed at least some engine power would be available. The Airbus was now essentially a massive glider with extremely limited control surfaces. Each adjustment to their flight path had to be precisely calculated. There would be no opportunity to add power and go around if the approach wasn't perfect the first time. The riverbed landing site was now visible through the cockpit windows, appearing alarmingly narrow from 12,000 feet up. "We've got one shot at this," the captain told his co-pilot. "I need you to call out altitudes and speeds continually." Their standard instrument landing system was useless here. They would need to visually judge their approach angle to avoid coming in too steep or too shallow. Too steep, and they'd hit with catastrophic force. Too shallow, and they'd miss their landing zone entirely. The optimal glide ratio required maintaining exactly 240 knots. Any faster would waste potential distance. Any slower could cause a premature stall. Captain Roberts manually disabled certain automated safety systems that would normally prevent extreme maneuvers. The situation demanded flying techniques that pushed beyond standard operating parameters. As they descended through 8,000 feet, a new crisis emerged. The hydraulic systems were showing signs of failure, gradually reducing control responsiveness. The aircraft's auxiliary power unit, designed to provide backup electrical power, had failed to start, likely damaged by debris from the first engine explosion. This meant they were operating on battery power alone, with essential systems beginning to degrade. The flight attendants reported that while passengers were frightened, they remained calm and were properly positioned for impact. Captain Roberts now had to make constant small corrections to their approach path, fighting against crosswinds that threatened to push them away from their narrow landing zone. What followed was described by aviation experts as a masterclass in energy management. Captain Roberts executed a series of S-turns to bleed off excess altitude without gaining speed, a technique more commonly seen in small aircraft than commercial airliners. As they passed through 5,000 feet, he began a final alignment with the riverbed. "We're going to be high," warned the co-pilot, noticing their approach angle. In response, Captain Roberts performed a maneuver that would later be studied in flight schools worldwide. A deliberate slip, essentially pointing the nose in one direction while the aircraft moved in another, creating drag to increase their descent rate without building speed. It was a technique rarely, if ever, employed in commercial jets, yet executed perfectly when it mattered most. At 1,000 feet above the ground, the reality of their situation became starkly apparent. The riverbed was strewn with rocks and uneven surfaces that weren't visible from higher altitudes. Captain Roberts now faced a split-second decision that would determine whether they landed on the relatively smoother central portion or the rougher edges. With remarkable precision, he adjusted their approach to target the best possible touchdown zone, knowing they had no power to adjust their path once committed. The silence in the cockpit was punctuated only by altitude callouts. 500 feet, 400, 300, each number bringing them closer to either disaster or miraculous survival. The landing gear presented another critical decision point. Conventional wisdom suggested keeping it retracted for a belly landing on rough terrain, but Captain Roberts made the counterintuitive choice to deploy it. His reasoning, later vindicated by safety analysts, was that the gear would absorb initial impact forces and potentially break away cleanly, whereas a belly landing on rocky terrain could rupture fuel tanks. As the gear locked into place, they were now just seconds from touchdown. The co-pilot completed the emergency checklist, ensuring fuel was cut off and all systems were configured to minimize fire risk on impact. Passengers were in brace position, and emergency services were racing toward coordinates they provided. At exactly 10:47 a.m., the massive aircraft made contact with the Earth in a manner no commercial airliner is designed to do. The initial touchdown was remarkably smooth, a testament to the captain's precise airspeed control. But within seconds, the uneven terrain began taking its toll as the landing gear encountered rocks and dips in the riverbed. The right main gear collapsed first, sending the aircraft skidding sideways in a shower of sparks. The left wing tip struck the ground, acting as an impromptu brake as it carved a furrow through the earth. Incredibly, the fuselage remained intact as the aircraft decelerated from 140 knots to a complete stop in just under 900 meters, half the distance normally required on a proper runway. When the dust settled, an eerie silence fell over the scene. Then, almost unbelievably, emergency exit doors began opening and evacuation slides deployed. Every single one of the 183 souls on board evacuated safely, with injuries limited to minor cuts and bruises. Fire crews arrived to find passengers standing in groups, many embracing each other in disbelief at their survival. Captain Roberts was the last to exit the aircraft, having checked every row for remaining passengers. As he stepped onto the riverbed, he allowed himself a brief moment to survey the relatively intact aircraft. Aviation authorities would later calculate the odds of successfully landing a commercial airliner without power on such terrain with no fatalities at less than 1 in a million. Yet through extraordinary skill and decision-making, Captain Roberts had done exactly that. The black boxes recovered from the aircraft told a story that would revolutionize aviation safety protocols worldwide. Voice recordings captured over 200 critical decisions made by Captain Roberts during the 15-minute emergency, with experts later identifying at least 17 points where a different choice would have likely resulted in catastrophe. The flight data recorder showed how precisely he had maintained the optimal glide ratio, never deviating more than 7 knots from ideal airspeed despite having no engine power or full hydraulic control. Perhaps most remarkably, the data revealed that he had managed to land almost exactly at the theoretical maximum glide distance possible for that aircraft type, stretching their glide ratio to its absolute limit. What caused both engines to fail simultaneously became the central question of the investigation. Initial inspections revealed that the first engine had ingested a flock of unusually large migratory birds at an altitude where such encounters are extremely rare. The second engine, investigators discovered, failed due to a previously unidentified design vulnerability where shrapnel from the first engine damaged critical fuel delivery components. This finding led to immediate inspections of similar aircraft worldwide and eventual redesigns of engine shielding systems. The manufacturer's engineers were stunned that such a cascade failure could occur, as redundancy systems should have prevented the second engine from being affected by the first engine's failure. The investigation team spent over 2,000 hours reconstructing the flight path and decision process. They created detailed simulations to test whether alternative choices might have yielded better outcomes. In simulation after simulation, no computer or test pilot could improve on Captain Roberts' performance. In fact, most attempts resulted in simulated crashes when trying to reach established airports instead of the riverbed. The lead investigator would later write, "What we witnessed was not just good piloting, but a perfect synthesis of experience, training, intuition, and grace under pressure. It represents the highest example of airmanship in commercial aviation history." The case study became mandatory reading at flight schools globally. Perhaps the most significant finding came from analyzing the cockpit voice recorder's background audio. Engineers noted that throughout the emergency, Captain Roberts' heart rate, audible to sensitive microphones when the cockpit was otherwise silent, never exceeded 85 beats per minute. This extraordinary physiological control under extreme stress became the subject of research by military and civilian aviation psychologists alike. How had he maintained such calm while facing what should have been overwhelming pressure? When later interviewed, Captain Roberts credited specific visualization techniques he practiced regularly. "I had crashed this exact scenario hundreds of times in my mind, working through all possible decisions. When it actually happened, It felt like I was executing a plan I already knew. This insight led to new approaches in emergency procedure training that emphasized mental rehearsal of worst-case scenarios. The impact of Flight 2311's near disaster extended far beyond immediate safety improvements. Aviation psychologists began studying what they termed crisis leadership, using Captain Roberts as their prime example. His approach, remaining calm, expanding options rather than narrowing them, and making decisive yet flexible decisions, became a template for training not just pilots, but emergency responders, military leaders, and corporate crisis managers. Business schools incorporated the case into leadership curriculums, analyzing how high-stakes decision-making under extreme time pressure could be optimized. The recorded communications between cockpit and cabin crew during the emergency also established new standards for crew resource management during crisis situations. The aircraft manufacturer implemented 17 specific design changes based on lessons from Flight 2311, including improved engine shielding, enhanced auxiliary power systems, and more robust hydraulic backups. Simulators worldwide were reprogrammed to include complete dual-engine failure scenarios at cruise altitude, something previously considered too improbable to warrant dedicated training time. Perhaps most significantly, the Roberts Protocol for emergency decision-making was integrated into standard training, a systematic approach to rapidly assessing all options, including unconventional ones, before committing to an action plan. Every commercial pilot now practices this methodology, potentially saving countless lives in future emergencies. Flight 2311 transformed Captain Roberts from an unknown professional into a reluctant public figure. Despite his discomfort with the attention, he recognized the importance of sharing his experience. He dedicated much of his subsequent career to training the next generation of pilots, with particular emphasis on mental preparation for emergencies. Technical skill is necessary but insufficient, he often told his students. The most important survival tool is the prepared mind. He developed specific visualization exercises now used by major airlines worldwide, teaching pilots to mentally rehearse responses to catastrophic failures until they become second nature. His methods have been credited with successful outcomes in at least 9 subsequent aviation emergencies. Perhaps the most profound legacy came from passenger testimonies about their experience. Remarkably, many reported that throughout the ordeal, the captain's voice on the intercom had kept them believing survival was possible. Even when announcing they would be making an emergency landing in a riverbed, information that could have caused panic, his tone conveyed competent control of the situation. Psychological studies of the passengers revealed significantly lower rates of post-traumatic stress compared to survivors of similar incidents, attributed largely to their confidence in the flight crew's abilities. This finding revolutionized how airlines train for emergency communications, emphasizing that how information is delivered can be as important as the information itself. The case of Flight 2311 ultimately transformed aviation's approach to crises, from emphasis on avoiding disaster to creating the conditions for survival against all odds. What we've just explored isn't just an aviation miracle. It's a blueprint for handling life's most challenging moments. Think about it. When have your engines failed in life, and how did you respond? Did you panic, or did you find that calm center like Captain Roberts? This extraordinary story reminds us that preparation meets opportunity in our most critical moments. The difference between disaster and triumph often lies not in the circumstances we face, but in how we choose to face them. Ask yourself, what's your riverbed solution? That unconventional approach that might save you when traditional paths aren't available? How are you mentally rehearsing for your own potential emergencies? Remember that Captain Roberts credits his success not to what he did in those 15 minutes, but to the thousands of hours spent imagining exactly such scenarios. What situations should you be visualizing now before you need that muscle memory? The most powerful takeaway from this incredible story is that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary outcomes through the right mindset and preparation. You don't have to be flying a commercial airliner to benefit from crisis leadership principles. These same approaches work for medical emergencies, business challenges, or personal crises. The capacity to expand options rather than narrow them under pressure is something we can all develop. If this story has inspired you to think differently about preparation and crisis management, don't keep these insights to yourself. Share them with those who might benefit from a new perspective on handling life's unexpected challenges. And if you want to discover more extraordinary stories of human resilience and the lessons they offer, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell. In our next video, we'll explore how another split-second decision saved hundreds of lives in circumstances that seemed utterly hopeless. Until then, remember, preparation isn't paranoia. It's the difference between being a victim of circumstances and becoming the master of your fate, just like Captain Roberts.